It is 4 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and begin. Thank you for your responses in the chat. We are so excited to have with us today Colleen Smith from the, I always want to say this wrong, National Museum of the American Indian. It's a Smithsonian museum, and she is going to share with us their essential understandings today and how we can use those in our classroom. And so I'm going to turn things over to her. I'm so excited about what we're going to learn today.
Awesome. Thank you, Kay. Hello, good afternoon. As Kay said, my name is Colleen Smith. I'm actually from Kentucky. I don't know if Kay, you knew that.
Oh, I don't think I knew that.
Yeah.
Oh,
So I grew up in Kentucky in the Frankfort area, and I actually started out as a teacher in Kentucky before moving to where I now live right outside of Washington, D.C. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But I appreciate folks' points in the chat. I'm checking out some of those. We'll come back to those in just a little bit. I wanted just to kind of quickly name that I would think a fair number of you all were here for probably about a month ago or so ago. There was a session that my colleague Renee Goki led that did some foundational thinking about teaching and learning about Native Americans and introduced some ideas around false, incomplete, and more complete narratives. And that's something that I'm gonna pick up again today, but more specifically, as Kay mentioned, we're gonna take a look at something that the museum, the National Museum of the American Indian, has produced that's called the Framework for Essential Understandings about Native Americans. And then within that, we also developed a guide that is meant
Probably
to
because this is not real. Oh, wait.
help support teachers for implementing some of those ideas actually into the classroom. So that's going to be the bulk of our time today. And then I will also extend an opportunity. I want to make good use of your time. I know it's already been a long school day. It's late in the week, it's the afternoon. But I did want to introduce you to one of our resources that we feature in our guide and also comes up as often a narrative about Native Americans, which is an inquiry-based resource on American Indian removal. So I'll spend some time previewing that resource for you and then also giving you some time to look through it a bit independently to see what connections you may have or additional questions and that sort of thing. So to get us started this afternoon, hopefully this graphic looks a bit familiar to you if you were here for the session that my colleague Renee Goki led. This brings up this idea of narratives, right? Narratives as ways we make sense of different pieces of a story that are put together. And in education, these narratives help to shape and make meaning for students, whether it's in the social studies or certainly into other disciplines as well. And in that work that Renee did with this group, she talked some about the idea of kind of narratives along a cycle, moving from some being false or misleading to many that are just incomplete, right? We don't have maybe all the different parts, to something that builds towards more complete narratives. And that's a lot of the work that we try to do to support teachers like yourselves who are charged with bringing a lot of different diverse experiences, perspectives into the classroom and helping you find resources to do that in a good way. So that was actually why I had asked the question in the beginning about what you remember from being a student about what you learned with Native Americans. So just kind of going back to some of these questions, and I don't really see necessarily, right, that these were, that you named that they were false or incomplete, but in looking through some of these, it very much lines up with a lot of the research that our department has done about how often content about Native Americans shows up in K through 12 education.
She's not talking to me about students.
A lot of it is definitely on narratives related to Thanksgiving. There's often a lot on food, shelter, clothing. Typically, it's often done more in the elementary grades, and it's often rooted in the past. Doesn't often follow people into the contemporary. So I would say, generally speaking, some of these are, if you're looking at this, graphic, kind of probably following in this incomplete and probably even some of the false, right? Certainly Some of the things that were named here with Thanksgiving, people are starting to understand that the common narrative on that isn't complete, and some parts of it are just not true. So as we go through things today, one tool that I'll be introducing to you all is our framework for essential understandings about Native Americans and a guide that you can use in the classroom. And that is really trying to help bring both students and then also teachers, because I can speak from my experience as a student in growing up in Kentucky. I had very limited exposure, access to content about Native Americans. It was pretty much limited to kind of Kentucky state history. At the time when I was there, it was probably fourth grade, and I remember doing like a play about Daniel Boone in my fourth grade history class, and there was a lot of stuff in that looking back was pretty inappropriate, but some of that's just a reflection that it's not something that is often taught, understood, and so it becomes harder to interrupt those false or incomplete narratives, because I think it's incredibly difficult as educators for you all to find kind of where you can gather more of those complete sources and perspectives and voices. So that's something that I really hope to share with you all today and give you a preview where you can go and examine a little bit more. So what I want to do, hopefully for myself, is to show you how our Essential Understandings Guide and some NK360 resources can help you construct more complete learning experiences for students about Native Americans. And the way I hope us to get us there so that you can actually articulate some of that is to first give you an overview of our essential understandings, what they are, what purpose they serve, and then how the guide is structured to support use of the essential understandings. And then we'll walk through the guide a little bit, giving you kind of a case study for how you might use or apply it in the classroom. And I did pull some Kentucky standards, both for English language arts and social studies, as kind of a way we can case study that with one of our resources in particular on American Indian removal. And then I'll want to reserve some time for you all to explore the resource on your own. I have some guiding questions that you can use to kind of help provide a path towards investigating the resource. And then we can close with some questions, any ideas you might have or some follow-up. So I think just to kind of step back, because I'm not sure, today of who's in the room, how many of you all were here for the kind of partner session that was done by other education staff. Just so we're all kind of oriented, as I mentioned, I work for the National Museum of the American Indian, and I'm in their education department. There are 3 locations, physical locations of the museum, one in Washington, D.C., where I'm based. I live right outside of Washington, D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia. I mentioned earlier, though, I'm originally from Kentucky, so that's very much kind of like my roots, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. And then we also have a physical museum in Lower Manhattan in New York City. And then we have our collections, and that's where museum staff steward and care for all the objects, material, culture that are in our collection. And I wanted to name this because across all 3 of these physical locations, education and supporting teachers is a big part of our work. And that brings us to our education initiative, Native Knowledge 360. And this is our national initiative. It's a kind of manifests itself online. There's digital content programming, but also on-site resources, teacher training, to really transform teaching and learning about Native Americans, so that over time, because it's a long process, when we ask questions about, what are your memories of teaching and learning about Native Americans, or kind of giving that the window of those stories opens up a bit more to bring in more complete narratives. But we know that to do that, the museum really needs to be a partner and a supporter and trainer and listener to teachers who are in the ground kind of figuring out, trying to bring some of these stories to their students in ways that are appropriate and culturally mindful. So one of the ways we started to do this in our education team was through kind of it's almost like a founding document for the education department, are our Native Knowledge 360 essential understandings. And so if you think about kind of the typical stories, some of the things that you all put in the chat about Native Americans, these essential understandings, I wouldn't say they're necessarily like a counter to that, but they're really looking to expand on that so that it's not just 5 things that come up again and again, like Thanksgiving, Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark, American Indian removal, or Trail of Tears, Plains Indian Wars, because that really isolates it. 1, all to the past. 2, it's very much limited to and when it's taught, often in the elementary grades, and often just in the social studies, right? So you're not seeing the range of disciplines, of contributions that you can bring in Native knowledge, Native perspective, Native experience into English language arts classes, into sciences, into the social studies. So I'm gonna right now, and excuse my eyes as they kind of wander a bit, I'm gonna put this into the chat. I'm gonna put our NK360 website, which we'll be going to later today, as well as our essential understanding. So if you wanna follow along, if you're on a tablet or your phone or your computer, you're welcome to. With these essential understandings, they're not a curriculum and they're not a set of classroom ready resources. What they are is a framework that helps to expand possibilities for different learning experiences you might create for your students. And how does it do that? One way is, as I mentioned, to move past only thinking about social studies as the place in which Native content comes up, and also to expand beyond where we often see the stories of Native people brought up. So if you are a social studies teacher, and that's my background, you might recognize these. I know the 10 themes for the social studies from the National Council aren't probably used as much. Certainly they're not used in your day-to-day, but they often can form kind of the foundation for building out curriculum. We took these essential understandings and look at them in a way of broadening out. So you think about the contributions of Native peoples, understanding more about their cultures, both historically and today, looking at connections with environment and culture, also looking at STEM and the role that Indigenous knowledge can play in solving environmental challenges and issues, looking at things that really come up in civics education, such as power, authority, and governance, and the role of tribes as nations who govern themselves. So these essential understandings you can find online. I'm also now going to put up the PDF where you can even print out if you'd like, and you can also request even print copies from our education office. So this was our starting place before in education as a way to kind of frame out a vision for what students might one day kind of come away with. So beyond those maybe 5 stories that come up again and again. Challenge is those aren't classroom resources, right? You can't pick this guide up and then have something to do with kids the next day. So it's a big leap to go from that to, okay, now a teacher feels equipped to then bring some of this stuff into his or her classroom. So recently we created, and this is what I'm going to share with you today, a guide for classroom application. So this is more of the so what, so the how do I teach this, right? So if there's this, if there's this really nice broader concept about American Indian cultures and how they're dynamic and they're changing, and that they're both an expression of an individual but a community, that's, it's beautiful language and it's accurate, but it's like, well, how do I translate that to my students and what resources can I use to do that? So we developed a guide to give educators a practical guide and some suggestions for how to connect some of these essential understandings to what they actually do in the classroom. And this is, a work in progress. And this actually, your group today are one of the first to kind of have this orientation to it. And we do really welcome feedback and thoughts on it. So I will be giving you my contact info as part of our session today. But before we dig into it, and I can share kind of a case study for you using some Kentucky standards, and I'm going to now share with you the EU guide, the actual guide. So the previous links in the chat, those bring you to those 10 essential understandings. What I just shared with you now is how to use them, some ideas for how you can actually bring resources into the classroom. So before we get in and kind of look at it, and you can look at it as we go along, or you can come back to it after this session today, kind of a quick note on how it's structured. So I mentioned, the essential understanding. So that big idea about American Indian cultures, that is part of what the guide covers. So it, restates that, shows it, and then those understandings are made up of kind of key concepts. And what that just means are examples to help give definition, clarity to what we're talking about within the essential understanding, a little bit more practical knowledge and content. Then we wanted to really take the next step of thinking about what does it look like to teach this? What could maybe a snapshot of a learning experience look like with that? So within each essential understanding that we focused on, and we chose 6 out of the 10. This guide it's quite robust. The nice thing is you can kind of jump around to the parts that feel relevant to you. But we chose 6 out of the 10 based on what standards are often taught, what teachers have told us for where they're interested in bringing some of these narratives in. So it's not all of them in there. It's a kind of more targeted set. So within those, you have brief kind of looks into how might this be taught in an English language arts classroom? What might it look like in a social studies setting? And then even how could this be applied in a science classroom? I believe this group represents a range of disciplines. My understanding is that a good number of you all are either social studies or English language arts, but there may be some other content areas in here. So hopefully you'll find some connection with it. And then finally, kind of the other link beyond just like starting a brainstorm for what this could look like in the classroom, we wanted to really help show teachers some featured NK360 resources. So stuff that's actually ready to use in the classroom, primary and secondary sources, short videos, historical treaties, objects from our collection, but how those are packaged together, to kind of create a learning experience. And that's where we have our NK360 featured resources. And that's what we'll be spending a little bit of time on today, in particular looking at American Indian removal as one of the topics that is often taught, but is often taught in a pretty incomplete way. And so what we want to do is support teachers in helping to kind of move the needle into more complete perspectives. So before I go to some of the case studies on the guide and then give you all a chance to really dig in, I just wanted to pause for a minute and see if there are any questions about, one, where you can find any of this. I'm happy to reshare some links, and or if maybe a question's popped up about either the essential understandings or the guide itself. So I'll pause for just a second to see if there's any questions.
And you can type those questions in the chat, or you can turn on your mic and talk as well.
Yeah.
Either one is fine. And all of the links you put in the chat, correct me if I'm wrong, Colleen, they're all already on the agenda. Correct?
They are. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. They're on the agenda. Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure.
Okay. All right. I think we're good. Okay. All right. So, as I mentioned, and I'm not sure how many of you all might be looking at the guide as we go along. As I mentioned, these, there's a lot in the guide, so I think it's one of those things you'll probably want to come back to, and also hopefully have some time in our smaller kind of sessions later in the afternoon today to dig into. But I wanted to kind of do a case study on our first essential understanding about American Indian cultures. And we're going to view that essential understanding through the lens of American Indian removal, which may seem like an interesting way to connect those, but that's part of our hope is that when educators and when students examine and learn about both historical and contemporary perspectives, both from Native Americans, that they're thinking about some of these big concepts around it and not just this isolated event that happened in time, but more a reflection of these larger ideas. So I'm going to share, just in case you wanted to look at it again, as you go through the Essentials Understanding Guide, because you might want to make some connections as you go in. Oops, excuse me, sorry. All right, so in the guide, I mentioned that it's kind of made up of 3 big parts, right? First is a look at the essential understanding itself, right? So for American Indian cultures, it's that culture is a result of human socialization. People acquire knowledge and values by interacting with other people through common language, place, and community. And in the Americas, the vast cultural diversity is among more than 2,000 tribal groups, and they have unique cultures and ways of life that span history from time immemorial to the present day. So as I mentioned, that's like a very robust statement. It starts to kind of challenge the idea of more generic ideas of American Indian culture, but then you're left with, okay, but how do I teach that? What does that mean? And that's where these key concepts can help to come into play. So this guide can also be a tool for yourself, honestly. That was something I did when I first came to the museum about 8 years ago to work on this. Was I really took time to read through it and become more familiar with these broader ways of thinking. So here, these key concepts help to kind of cut down, I think, on those more incomplete or false narratives, such as, there's no single American Indian culture, that cultures are always dynamic and changing, that interactions with Europeans and Americans have been devastating to American Indian cultures. However, Native people continue to maintain the integrity and viability of their societies. So what I just explained to you now, the essential understanding, right? The big idea around American Indian cultures, and then these key concepts that give a little more clarity. That was like the 1.0 version of our framework. What we wanted to do was step it into this idea of how can you actually teach it? What does it look like for students to grapple with some of these ideas in ways that are realistic given the constraints that teachers face with both standards, with time, with some of the unique nature of every school, right? It's all going to be different. So this is meant to be some ideas for how to kind of think about that. So in here, it's little snapshots of how you might bring in American Indian cultures to an English language arts classroom, into the social studies, or even into science classes. And then for each of these key concepts, we dig in and attach it to one of our featured NK360 resources. And because American Indian removal, I think, is a topic that people are somewhat familiar with, it might be more of those incomplete narratives. You might know it only as something for the Cherokee, right? When it really was for many tribes across the whole Eastern Range. And it wasn't just in an isolated time period, it spanned across presidential administrations. Things like that, we want students to start to understand so that their only takeaway isn't this, that singular tribes were removed. So that's when we want to dig in and show how this one particular resource, American Indian Removal, what does it mean to remove a people, can help to show students some of these key concepts. And so what I did in preparation for today was kind of step back and think a little bit as, I remember in being in the classroom, what some of the standards, right, that I'm called to meet, how those might help to intersect with, and hopefully make it to where you don't feel like you have to do extra work to justify bringing in some of these more complete narratives. And I recognize that's a tall order. It's not the expectation that you completely change, the course of how you might already be bringing in some perspectives and stories. It's just a way to kind of give some ideas along the way. So for our kind of demo today, if you're following along, this is after like the table of contents in the guide. There's a feature on this particular essential understanding about American Indian cultures. And then we're going to focus on these two key concepts that when thinking about American Indian cultures, it's important to understand that interactions with Europeans and Americans brought real devastating changes to American Indian cultures. But that also needs to be put into and kind of a tension with the reality that Native people today do still continue to exercise and maintain the viability of their societies and cultures, but it often might look a little bit different or a lot different. And that's something I think that's often missing for when people teach about Native American history, but also cultures and contemporary lives, is that contemporary piece. So even in something which you'll have some time to explore, the removal resource, we really work hard to bring different case studies of tribes into the present day, so that students don't walk away with the idea that it's completely in the past, and that there wasn't a lot of, that there was a great deal of perseverance and moving through the trauma that it did actually create. So if I'm thinking about something like English language arts, excuse me, certainly the topic of removal would not probably be the first thing on my mind of how to teach different things within English language arts. I can get that. One thing we're trying to work on thinking more about and supporting teachers with, though, and oftentimes the solutions are coming from you all, it's more of we want to help equip you with some sources or access to information that you might not ordinarily get, is to use some of the skill-based standards that you're called to meet and bring in Native content through that. So as an example, and this is 8th grade as a snapshot, if you think about informational text, that's a really rich area where you can start to bring in even some content from a historical background, but into teaching and include Native voices on that. So our American Indian removal, and it's an inquiry-based lesson, has ample opportunity for students to practice things like citing textual evidence, looking for central ideas of the text, analyzing that development over time. We try to put in tasks that kind of build on some of those key skills. Also thinking about the idea of not only stuff that's done expressly in the text, but where students have to draw inferences. So that's one area that might be opportunity for, if you are in the English language arts area, to think about possibly a unique way to bring in some of those skills and those ideas. Another advantage or a feature, I think, of some of our resources is that we include a range of source types. And when I'm saying sources, it could be text, it could be images, it could be short videos, objects from our collection. And I think sometimes within the English language arts, you're having students think about the types of sources that they're reading and those advantages and disadvantages for conveying ideas. So once again, it's taking maybe a content area that you wouldn't normally think of to bring in and Native voices perspectives, and using skills as the delivery to kind of get that in there. So that's one idea. And then for the social studies, certainly I think this is something that people often think of course, because it's actually in like a scope and sequence in terms of American Indian removal and where it might fit and play out. But what we're hoping here is that you can see connections across different disciplines within the social studies for the idea of, for civics, for economics, for geography, how each of these could be ways to open up ideas of a different way to think about removal. As an example, for civics, if you're teaching about roles and responsibilities, how different groups have worked to challenge and push against just or unjust laws or the rights of citizens. American Indian Rule is an interesting case study because you see tribes using some of these foundational documents, using treaties as a way to try to gain and maintain and affirm rights. And we'll give you some time to kind of look at some of those case studies so you could kind of see where some of those connections might be. I'm going to pause for just a second. I'm going to share also, just so if you wanted to look at it, and we'll be going into this in more detail. I'm going to go and preview though our American Indian removal inquiry, which is what we'll be spending some time on. Any immediate questions or concerns or anything that has popped up in thinking about this idea of kind of when you have this guide, and I don't know how many of you guys might even have the guide up if you're using it, but the idea is we want to first take this broad idea about American Indians and then find some possible ways in to where you could hopefully use it in your teaching. And that's what this guide is really all about. Any questions? You're welcome to put them in the chat. And then I will actually have a question for you all. It was going to be a poll, but I'll change it up a little bit. All right.
Not really a question, but just a comment. I think it's very important for us to start letting our students see the Indians and the heritage of the Indians just as people. We have, whenever we're in elementary school, we portray them almost as just characters in a story. And I think even myself, I almost saw them as cartoon characters. They weren't really people or anything like that. They were someone that they like. I don't know how to really put it in words. It's just, I don't think that it conveyed the correct story early on enough. That because we paint such a pretty picture to kindergarten, first, second, third graders, that we see, the cute little headdresses that we make out of colorful construction paper, and everybody sitting around having first Thanksgiving together. And we don't teach them that the Pilgrims came in and devastated these people. And I don't want to get graphic with little kids either, but I think we need to open the conversation up at an earlier age to let them know, that it wasn't a cute little story as we've been told since first grade.
Sure. Yeah, and that's hard too, because if I understand, all of you are secondary educators, right? Middle and high. So yeah. Not only are you maybe trying to bring things into what you're currently teaching, but then you're also with the reality of, meeting kids kind of where they are, but there's a lot of unpacking of what's been taught and knowing how to untangle that. And sometimes, to be honest, I think also as educators, American Indian content isn't often prioritized at all in teacher education programs and training, and I think some of that's a reflection, right, of society, and kind of there's a lot there. So I think certainly the challenge of bringing some of these more complete narratives in at very early ages is incredibly important. It's funny you mentioned, the Thanksgiving story, right? And it's this national story, right, that people become familiar with. And I think it's changed a bit over time. I think some people now know it was a little more complicated than just randomly you have Native peoples suddenly deciding to be fast friends with a group of newcomers. But there's still a lot of misinformation out there, and there's still a lot of incomplete and inaccurate narratives. And so we're actually right now working on a really robust kind of inquiry-based, question-based resource for 3rd through 5th graders about the truer story of Thanksgiving. And again, it's not to scare, it's not to create guilt or assign right and wrong, but to instead examine it from a more truthful light about these relationships, right, that had happened, and what was kind of at stake, and how difficult choices were to be made between both the Wampanoag peoples and the English newcomers. And it wasn't as simple as people coming for this, meal. And in fact, the meal was one of the least important things. There was a lot of other stuff happening at the time. And so we are wanting to support educators and giving them some tools to help them dig into some of those narratives in age appropriate ways, so that when they go through their education system, maybe they're a little bit more ready to ask questions, and to think a little bit more broadly. So I think it's great that, you're starting, that you've named that as a thing that you've already seen.
Well, the one of the wonderful things that I've learned while being in the Achieve program is the true stories that I was, as an educator, I didn't even know. I was still had in my mind the cartoons of how we all just got together and everything was good. But I come from a background of teaching mostly sixth grade and then went into a special education background. So the social studies aspect of things that Achieve is helping me grasp so that I can incorporate that with my special needs kids is just opening a world that I didn't know was there. So it's just something that as sixth graders, I think that by the time they're 11, 12 years old, they need to start opening their eyes a little bit more or be taught the true story a little more.
Yeah.
And I know we're talking about, American Native Indians, but I teach 7th grade. So I teach World Civ, but we talk, about Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
And we delve into the explorers, and it's eye-opening to these kids because we talk about equity and providing them multiple perspectives. Like when they see how the interactions of explorers were, like it is eye-opening to them. Oh, we've not heard it this way. We've not seen it this way. And then when you're giving them these documents about things, they're kind of shook that happened in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that window of multiple perspectives is a great way to bring more Native content in. And I recognize it's challenging in that you're held to, like, as you mentioned, as a 7th grade, you have a certain kind of area, right, that you're trying to cover, and it's a huge area in itself. I will also, though, share after this, I can send it to Kay or others, but we have some resources on, and it might be a bit different though, on Inca and Maya, and some of the more hemispheric kind of look.
Yes.
But I think in just kind of reviewing the Kentucky standards, which have changed since I used to teach them, but it does look like there's a window in, through multiple perspectives, through thinking about conflict and compromise, using some of those themes. And really, as I saw someone put in the chat, the idea of agency, right? And that these are, sure, they're in a lot of how students come to understand it as historical figures, right? But they are people, they're not characters. And all these people, both native, non-native, are at a point where they're having to make, choices about how they're going to survive and live and hopefully thrive and, maintain the societies and communities that they already have. And so I think one thing that I hope is if we spend some time in the removal inquiry, is you take something like a topic of removal, which I think is often done as very, it is a tragic part of this history, of this country's history, and it is devastating what happened. And the tribes that are impacted and pushed through were very much responsive actors and pushed to avoid and pushed against the forces of removal. It was a hotly debated topic. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. I think for kids to think about the fact of their own agency, right, when thinking about events and topics of today that they hear in the news, and that there's a real ability for people to make choices and make decisions. And that is also true for Native peoples, both historically and today. So to kind of take them as, I think someone mentioned earlier, out of, and sorry, I don't always see the names of coming up, but out of this idea is these these characters or kind of these folks that we can't understand and relate to. And I think it's challenging in some ways. In Kentucky, it's not as much of a visible part of everyday life. And so I think as a reality of that, when I've gotten to meet and travel and spend time in some of the Western states and in Washington State and Montana and the Dakotas, it's a really interesting thing to see the differences of how students engage with the history, both non-Native and Native. So that's something that I think I appreciate as a challenge for Kentucky educators, is to bring visibility to that when this state's history, each state kind of has their own story with that. So I saw a couple of messages. Oh, okay. All right, so I'm gonna now go into so this is just a reminder, right, that we're trying to move towards more complete narratives, and we're kind of thinking about this in a moment, specifically in the idea of American Indian removal. And I've been talking a lot. I want you all to have some time to kind of examine some ideas. And for some of you, it may make more sense to look through our NK360 site on other topics, but I do want to first show you where you can find a particular resource that's featured in that EU guide on American Indian removal. So I'm just gonna jump over to our website. So this is the Native Knowledge 360 education, basically our home for all of our resources. And I invite you, to come back here, as time allows. I know you don't have a lot of time in your lives, but there's a wealth of lessons and resources. I mentioned things on Maya and Inca. We also have professional developments, both recorded webinars upcoming. So there might be some other topics that you'd be interested in. But right now we're going to jump to, this was on the agenda, the link for the website is, we're going to go into our resource about American Indian removal. And I had initially done a, sorry, went to the wrong place, a poll to ask this question, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it. So I'll just ask, and folks can just volunteer via voice. I'm just curious how many folks are familiar with like C3 inquiry approach, like the design of, the inquiry design model. Because I feel like it's one of those things that as museum educators, we might have one idea of how folks use it versus the reality. So I guess if you don't mind, not everybody has to jump in
Colleen,
there.
we've actually done a lot of training surrounding
perfect.
that within these grants, and also we have one of the writers of the C3 framework is actually doing some training for us in December. So
okay, awesome. I'm just gonna.
So they should all be pretty familiar.
Okay, pretty familiar. All right, great. The reason why I say that, I'm not going to try to train you on that. I realize you have skills that I don't.
It is very useful that you're addressing this because it is a part of our standards.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. I know the kind of the background, and I'm imagining it might be Kathy Swan or maybe one of the other folks in that group. Yeah,
yes.
And I'd worked under her when I was in grad school. But anyway, I reference that because our resource on removal is modeled mostly on the inquiry design model. So we have a compelling question: what does it mean to remove a people? And then we want students to move through that question with those smaller, right, supporting questions. And this is the resource I want to give you all some time to look at on your own a bit, not having just kind of be talked to, but I did want to highlight a few things. So one is that to get around the inquiry, because it's a very robust site, and that's a good thing, but can also feel really overwhelming if you're coming to it for the first time. And we do have a good number of these more inquiry focused resources, and I realize that's, once again, hitting on social studies maybe versus some of the other disciplines, but I think one nice thing about how this is done digitally is that you can jump to different sections and maybe not have to do a whole, from staging the question down to informed action type of inquiry. You might take one supporting question about perhaps a Native nation that students aren't as familiar with, the Muskogee Nation, and look at their experience with removal. We also have another supporting question that looks at kind of these really discrete case studies about how 6 different nations tried to avoid removal. So if we think back to some of those key concepts, right, with our essential understanding about American Indian cultures, one of them is to acknowledge the devastation that happened as a result of European and American actions with Native tribes. But it's also to look at persistence, resilience, agency. And that is a big part of this inquiry. Another big part of this inquiry is to help show students the scope of removal, that it wasn't just one tribe, it wasn't just the Cherokee. We do have a featured case study on the Cherokee Nation, But we want students to understand that this was a much broader in scope, really policy effort by the whole United States government. And that it didn't just happen under Jackson, it happened across several different presidents. So to get through the inquiry, as I mentioned, you could go to different discrete case studies that kind of act as our supporting questions. You could also just follow the arrows down. So this is our staging the question. We use an introduction video that was filmed actually using voices of middle school students who had tested the lesson with us and some of their responses to it. We have things like, maps to show some of the many tribes and the impact there. Sorry, I'm gonna have to move that. In terms of removal, there we go. We have essay from a historian at the museum. That's something that could maybe help from a teacher's point of view or also as an extension for students. So this just kind of warms students up to think about this idea of removal, what that word kind of, does it make sense? How could it make sense? And to start to think about differing perspectives on that from leaders at the time, right? Native leaders and a leader that students probably would be more familiar with, President Jackson. We do, as I mentioned, spend some time though talking about how this was started long before President Jackson. Sorry, this is giving me a hard time there. Okay. And then I'll just quickly go through here. Our first supporting question looks at a nation that students might not be as familiar with. What was the Muskogee Nation's experience with removal? And this is also known as the Creek, if that's a word or a term you're familiar with. One feature of this resource and a lot of our NK360 resources is that we do include pronunciation support. So, because I think sometimes that can be a barrier to people feeling comfortable teaching about using learning, is that they might get a word, the name of a nation wrong or pronounce a leader's name incorrectly. So that's something we tried to do within each case study, is to make sure we highlight, cultural terms, place names, tribes, so that there's a little bit more confidence there for both teachers and students. And then this is our third supporting question. How did 6 different nations try to avoid removal? And this is where students kind of learn about, and this is, I think, one of our more popular sections of the inquiry. I mean, I feel awkward using the word popular with removal, but in the sense of its use, the Potawatomi Nation, Cherokee, Seminole, Kickapoo, Shawnee, and the Eastern Shawnee Nation. So this is, I think, if time is an issue, if it's certainly if you're maybe coming at this from a non-social studies discipline, but you maybe want to try something out where you bring in maybe some informational text, you might consider using one of these case studies to push back against those incomplete narratives of removal as, victimhood, that it was one single nation, that it was in one small period of time. We have a lot of different types of sources, both this kind of graphic novel that gives an overview of it, of the experience, and then a more deeper case study where they get to look at different types of sources. So a treaty, and we have the transcription here, both paraphrased and original, a map, image, document, the idea of multiple sources. And then for the conclusion, we want students to come to their own ideas, arguments about the meaning of removal, what it might, kind of their take on that from maybe some of the different nations that they explored more. And then in the section, if you're familiar with C3 framework, that often there's a call for informed action or kind of a civic connection to today. And that's where we look at some contemporary cases, not certainly of American Indian removal, but of this idea of the forces of removal. What can push communities and people away from their homes, and what does that mean? And so we have one related to climate with the Guna tribe off the coast of Panama. And then this Raise a Story is about child migration after a war. So this is something that students can probably find connection to. It's not American Indian content, but it gets at the idea of forces that push people away and how they try and have agency to respond. So now what I'm going to do, I want to give you guys about, say 12 minutes or so just to kind of look around, see, certainly this website. I'm going to send this to you again in the chat. I'll also put it, let's see, there. And then I put a few questions, excuse me, just in a Google Doc, ideas for, if it's helpful, if you like to have questions to kind of help guide your exploration. If you want to just kind of have some time to look through things, that's fine too.
And Colleen, aren't those questions on our agenda? I believe
They
they're on
are.
the agenda.
Yeah, they're on your
if you're
agenda.
looking
Yep,
at the
yep.
agenda, we're going to go to breakout rooms. Is that correct?
That's right. And they're just random. I just wanted you a chance to kind of get a break from a presenter, go look at some of these resources. I'll also send, because I know sometimes the chat doesn't follow you. So I just want to make sure folks know how to get to our website. We'll go there real fast too.
I can throw that into the room
Awesome.
to get there. And also just pull up your agenda because those questions are there.
That's right.
So are you ready for me to send them to breakout rooms?
Yes, that sounds great.
Okay, here we go. Pauline, I've got about 30 seconds. Do you want me to close those breakout rooms now?
Oh, you can wait a little bit longer. I was just in one, so I wanted to hop back. But
Okay.
that's
You just
fine.
tell me when.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. I think it's fine to go ahead.
What was the timer I set?
Perfect.
We have a message in the chat. I really enjoyed looking through the information on the inquiry. I thought it would be very engaging for students.
I saw a question. I can just address it for the whole group because I think it actually could be interesting. It's from Andrea about the role of enslaved peoples and how that also was part of the removal story and kind of, and also the tribes, slaveholding tribes. And I did want to just say that the resource you just looked at, American Indian Removal, the inquiry, does not go into that. But there is an exhibition. It's at the DC Museum, but it's also, we have an online kind of version of it. It's called Americans. And in that, it covers, if you go to the site itself, we'll go to there's a dialogue toolkit for educators, and there's some other resources here, but I'm just going to take you to the online exhibition. The reason why I mention this is that it looks at some of those same, I'm going to turn that off, some of those same stories, right, of like these ubiquitous things that come up again and again, but that are very incomplete and misunderstood. And one of the stories that it goes into is American Indian removal, but from a very different lens than what that inquiry looks at. So kind of the central question of this exhibition, it looks at how do we see so many representations, both problematic, but maybe for others not problematic? How can it be like so pervasive and part of what we see all the time, from street names, right, to mascots, to how people might see, different, material culture? How is that everywhere? But then underneath that, so few of us really understand, and I should say from a non-native perspective, someone like myself, really understand the long history of the connections between Native Americans and then the idea of Americans. So it's a lot. There's a lot in there. It's a fascinating exhibition. It's a lot different for the museum to have done. But the reason why I raised that is that they do have a section on removal. And in that, it looks at kind of debunking some things that people often think about with removal, and examining other aspects, including the role of enslaved people. So I just wanted to point you there. If you go to our, and I apologize, I don't know if if Andrea's still here, but if you go to the way I got here is if you go to our National Museum of the American Indian website, you go on exhibitions. This is also a wonderful place to go for students sometimes to do, if you ever do like virtual field trips or have them examine things. Some of the virtual exhibitions or online components, are pretty robust. They're pretty good. So while you can't maybe go to DC and tour that, you might want to preview this and have your students take a look at it, depending. And there's other stories in here as well. There's a great video on Thanksgiving, Plains Indian Wars, and this is Pocahontas here. So I'll close that out. I think you guys can probably
Eileen, do you want me to close the rooms now and bring them back?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I said that. I apologize.
Okay.
My bad.
It takes about 60 seconds.
Okay, no worries. I'll quickly repeat that, but not to put folks too far in. And then Kay, just as a quick question with you, if I wanted to send you like an updated list of some links, like that might include some of these online exhibitions, would that be appropriate to do, to send via
Absolutely.
email?
Yeah,
Okay.
just send those to me and I'll make sure everybody gets those.
Okay, cool. Because that might be another way to think about some of this stuff. All right. For those of you just coming in, I just wanted to quickly name that I saw some questions in the chat just about some other aspects of removal that often aren't talked about, including role of enslaved Africans. And I just wanted to point out that in addition, the removal inquiry does not go into that, but we do have some online exhibitions that do cover that. In particular, there's one called Americans, and it looks at the story of removal from some other, to include a more expansive look, including that point that was raised. And I apologize for the brief piece on it. I was talking through it before folks were back from their breakout rooms. That was my bad. So I'm happy, and I'll share those links with Kay after the fact, so you can go in and check them out. So, all right, so we have a few more minutes. I don't know if anybody, I think oftentimes in these PDs, right, we come back and hopefully share things that felt relevant or interesting or other questions. Would love to hear that, but I also hear that it's 5:11 p.m. on Thursday, and this is a long afternoon, so I did want to make myself available if there were any questions and or discussion points that felt like you'd like to bring it up with the group. I'd love to hear, but I won't pressure anybody.
So I actually have used the Native Knowledge 360. I did it about 2 years ago. I think
Really?
it wasn't as extensive as what you guys seem to have now,
Yeah.
but what I was using it for was for Native removal and the Indian Removal Act. You guys had, I think it was called resisting removal, and there were like 6 components of it. It was
Yes.
almost more of like a digital story, and it had like current Native stories that I used. Now I used it with 8th grade, and I thought it was like fantastic for that, because I thought it really like humanized the issue. A lot of the times it's like, okay, well, that was what happened back then, and it's unfortunate, but we're moving on. And I thought like it had like current Cherokee leaders, and they were talking about their personal experience. I remember one in particular was saying how his like great grandmother was like a Cherokee princess, and how she had died along the Trail of Tears and like was buried in an unmarked grave, and talking about like how impactful that was for him and his family. But then I also really liked that it talked about how they're still resisting removal by still maintaining like a strong structure, a strong culture. And so I think it like brought, one of the things I really liked about it is I think it made my kids have a lot of questions to bring up for discussion. I know you mentioned like it's important not to just focus on one group, and I agree, but unfortunately, with this curriculum, we sometimes have to. But going on, like now I teach high school, and when we're talking about like the Dawes Act and things of that nature, we do have to revisit removal just to make those connections. And I feel like that would maybe be an opportunity where we could delve into some of those other tribes as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And if you look at the Dawes Act, there's also a few other kind of like treaties-based inquiries, but that you might be able to pull some kind of resources from. Once again, not feeling like you have to do the whole thing because it's very expansive, but different pieces. But that's great to hear. That sounds like it's I'm imagining it's the Cherokee Nation case study that we had added to that removal inquiry. And so I think I'm glad to hear. Hopefully it's useful. I apologize, I have kids coming home. But I just want to close. I will offer, just because I know it's coming right up on 5:15 for you all, my email, if additional questions come up, or if something I raised it, and if you'd like to follow up on, didn't make wanted to make that connection on at some point, I'd be happy to answer what questions I can, but then also connect you all with some great resources that we have outside of just our education department. Because as I mentioned to one of the individuals in our breakout group, there's a wide range of amazing folks who I work with. Some of us are former teachers, but a lot of them are, Native scholars. There's certainly historians, curators, and I think a lot of them are really also invested in wanting to support you as teachers and what you do. So I'd love to try to help make those connections, if that's possible. So I hope this was valuable, or at least might spark some curiosity. And I really thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I hope you all have a really good evening. happy to stay on for a little bit if there's any other questions. But I will, I guess, Kay, hand it over to you if you'd like to, I don't know if you'd like to close them out or.
So are these, your email is all caps like that?
It doesn't matter. Sorry. I think it's the like format of the PowerPoint. If you send it to me in all caps, it'll work. But
Okay.
I'll also just put it in the, here, I'll do it now in the chat too.
I just wanted to make sure that we put that on our agenda so people could access that. We
Okay.
really thank you, Colleen. It's been a great
Yeah.
night. Guys, if you have any questions, please turn on your mics and ask now. I do have that they have asked you to complete a survey for them to help them with feedback. I have put that and the sign-in and evaluation both at the bottom of the agenda. I will also put both of those in the chat for you. So make sure that you do the sign-in and evaluation. This is the one I'm putting in right now, because that's how you get credit for attending. And then I'm going to put in the survey that Renee sent us that she would like you all to complete for. Those are both there in the chat. Any questions? Anything that you want to comment or say? And make sure you tweet all of the Twitter hashtags are on the agenda as well in the footer. So you have access to those. I will stop recording at this time.